Chapter 3. Attack by Stratagem. The night had grown deep and the fire in the camp had died down to a soft glow. Harguth and Zul'jin sat on opposite sides of the fire pit, lost in their own thoughts, when a young orc hunter, Zogga, returned to the camp from his hunt. The sound of his footsteps alerted the two chief orcs and they both turned to look at him as he approached. Zogga was a skilled hunter, and he carried with him the spoils of his hunt, a large deer that he had killed. He was a young orc, but he had already proven himself to be a valuable member of the tribe. As he approached, Harguth and Zul'jin welcomed him with a grunt and gestured for him to join them by the fire. As he sat down, he placed the deer beside him and gestured for them to take some. They nodded in gratitude, and as they sat by the fire, the three of them discussed the day's events and shared their thoughts about the war ahead. The fire was the only source of light in the camp, casting a warm glow on the orcs' faces, and giving the place a sense of camaraderie and unity. They knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but they were determined to face it together, united in purpose and action. "We must use the wisdom of our ancestors to our advantage," Harguth said as he gestured towards the fire with his hands. "Our strategy must be one of cunning and deception, for that is the way of war." "Indeed," Zul'jin agreed. He nodded and added, "We must make use of any opportunity that presents itself and be ever vigilant in our battle plans." Zogga spoke up then, "What if we cannot outwit our enemies? What other strategies should we consider?" Harguth smiled slowly and replied, "The wise orc knows that there are many paths to victory. We can use the terrain to our advantage, surprise them with unexpected tactics, or even enlist the aid of allies. No matter what, we must remain flexible and creative in our approach." "It is wise to take the enemy's country whole and intact," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. "We must strive to capture an army, regiment, or company rather than destroy them." Zul'jin agreed. "The wisdom of our ancestors teaches us that it is better to subdue than to vanquish. We must strive to make use of what we can and not waste our resources on unnecessary destruction." Zogga spoke up then, his voice soft but earnest. "But what if the enemy is too powerful? What then?" Harguth smiled at Zogga. "In such a case," he said, "we must be creative. We must look for weaknesses in our enemies and exploit them. We must use guile and cunning to outwit our foes and gain the upper hand." "Indeed," Harguth replied, gesturing with his hands. "We must use our cunning and clever tactics to outwit our opponents and break their will without having to resort to violence." He looked over at Zul'jin, who nodded to him. Zogga spoke up then, his voice hesitant but determined. "What if we cannot do that? What if we must fight?" "If it comes to that, then we must do so with honor and courage," Harguth said firmly. "We must fight as one, and never give up until victory is achieved. That is the orc way." He paused for a moment before continuing, "But remember, it is always better to find a way to win without bloodshed. That is the true mark of a leader." "Yes, indeed. Our ancestors taught us well. We must deny the enemy their plans and keep them divided. That is the best way to win this war." Harguth paused for a moment and looked at Zul'jin before continuing, "We must also remember that we must be ready to fight in the field if it comes to that." Zogga, who had been silent until now, spoke up, "What about attacking walled cities? Is that not an option?" Harguth shook his head slowly, "No. Walled cities are often too heavily defended and can be difficult to breach. We should avoid them if possible." He glanced around the fire before adding, "But if it is our only option, then we must be prepared to take the risk and face whatever consequences may come." "It is true," Zul'jin stated solemnly, prodding the fire with a stick. "Our ancestors taught us that it is best to avoid besieging walled cities if we can. We must plan our strategy carefully and be prepared for the long haul. Gathering materials for mantlets and other implements of war will take time, as will preparing mounds against the walls." Harguth nodded, adding, "We can do all the planning and preparation we want, but ultimately, it is Tempest who decides our destiny." He paused for a moment before turning to Zogga. "What say you, young hunter? What have you learned from your tribe's elders?" Zogga cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting between the two chiefs. "I have learned that a wise warrior knows when to fight and when to wait. A battle fought too soon can end in disaster, while a battle won through patience can bring great victory." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. My tribe also taught me that courage and strength are important, but wisdom is the key to success in battle. It is true, Zul'jin said, his voice low and grave. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, punctuating his words with emphasis. We must be prepared for the consequences of a siege. We must use wisdom and strategy to ensure our victory, or we will suffer dearly. Our ancestors have taught us that attacking recklessly will only lead to disaster. We must plan our strategy carefully and consider all possible outcomes before we act. Harguth paused for a moment, then added, Our fate lies in the hands of gods, but we must do our part to ensure success. Zogga watched the two chiefs intently, his eyes wide with wonder. He could feel the power of their words, and it made him shiver with anticipation. He wanted to join them in the conversation, but he held back, content to listen and learn. Indeed, it is wise to use our wits instead of brute force, said Harguth. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, emphasizing his point. We must be cunning and use our resources wisely if we are to succeed. Zul'jin nodded in agreement. Yes, we must outsmart our enemies and use the terrain to our advantage. Zogga spoke up from where he was sitting, looking from one chief to the other. But what if our enemies are too powerful for us? What then? Harguth looked over at Zogga and smiled. Then we must use whatever means necessary to gain the upper hand. We must be patient and wait for the right moment to strike. We must never give up hope, no matter how dire the situation may seem. Just as our ancestors have said, Harguth began, gesturing with his hands. We must be wise in our strategy and use the terrain to our advantage. If we can keep our forces intact and outwit our enemies, then victory will be ours. He looked over at Zul'jin and nodded sagely. Zul'jin grunted before adding, but we must also remember that even with a perfect plan, fate may still not be on our side. We must remain vigilant and await the outcome with patience. At this, Zogga spoke up. So what are our chances of winning this war? Harguth smiled at the young orc's enthusiasm before answering. Our chances are good, but we must never underestimate our opponents. It is important to stay focused and to remain aware of our surroundings. With careful planning and courage, we can prevail against any adversary. Harguth moved his hands to emphasize his point. We must remember the wisdom of our ancestors and use it to our advantage, he said. If we outnumber our enemies, we should divide our forces into two, so that we can encircle them and prevent their escape. Zul'jin grunted, adding, and if we are outnumbered, we must choose our battles carefully and use the terrain to our benefit. We cannot let our enemies surprise us. Zogga spoke up then, his voice hesitant but earnest. But what if our enemies are too strong for us to face head-on? How can we win in such a situation? Harguth smiled at the young orc's question, and answered, that is where strategy comes in. We must use our wits and cunning to outmaneuver our opponents. We must exploit their weaknesses and use deception to gain the upper hand. We must attack by stratagem. Harguth gestured towards the fire. It is true, Zul'jin, that we must be mindful of our numbers and assess our strengths and weaknesses before engaging in battle. If we are not evenly matched, it may be wise to flee or avoid the enemy altogether. Zul'jin grunted, we must also remember that no matter how strong we might be, if the odds are stacked against us, it is best to retreat and live to fight another day. Zogga spoke up then, his voice hesitant. But what if we are outmatched and fleeing is not an option? Harguth smiled at the young hunter. Then, my friend, we must employ strategy. We must use cunning and guile to outsmart our opponents, and employ their weaknesses against them. We must use the terrain and our knowledge of the land to our advantage, and rely on surprise tactics to gain victory. This is known, Harguth said, gesturing with his hand to emphasize his point. We must remember that even if our numbers are few, we can still use the terrain and other elements to our advantage. Zul'jin grunted. Yes, indeed. We must not forget that the outcome of any battle is ultimately decided by gods, no matter how great or small our numbers may be. Zogga spoke up then, curiosity evident in his voice. But what of our strategy? Surely there is more to winning a battle than simply relying on fate? Harguth smiled at the young orc's inquisitiveness. Of course there is. We must also take into account our enemy's weaknesses and exploit them. We must also use cunning and guile to outwit our opponents, so that we can gain an advantage. He paused for a moment before adding, and most importantly, we must never underestimate the power of courage and determination. It is true, Zul'jin said, grunting. We must be strong and vigilant if we are to succeed. We must not forget the wisdom of our ancestors. Harguth nodded and gestured to the fire. Indeed. We must use the terrain to our advantage, and be ever watchful of our enemies. Zogga, who had been listening silently, spoke up then. But what about strategy? Is there something more we can do other than relying on fate? Harguth and Zul'jin exchanged a look. Yes, indeed, Harguth said. Strategy is key to success. We must use cunning and deception to outsmart our enemies, and never underestimate their capability. We must be prepared for any eventuality, and always have a plan. It is true, Zul'jin said, his voice low and grave, that a chief must always be aware of the conditions that affect an army if he is to lead it well. He must be mindful of how to best use the terrain and the resources available to him. If a chief does not understand these things, then he risks hobbling his own army. Harguth nodded, then added, we also must remember that we must use our officers wisely, only employing those who are suited to their tasks. If we do not, then we risk shaking the confidence of our soldiers and putting them at unnecessary risk. The two chiefs fell silent for a moment, their gazes flickering around the campfire as the night grew darker. Finally, Zogga spoke up, his voice small but earnest. Are there any other strategies we should consider? Zul'jin smiled and patted the young hunter's shoulder. Yes, indeed. We must never forget the importance of deception and surprise. It is often better to trick your enemies rather than to fight them head-on. We must also remember to make use of our allies, and to work together as one. With these strategies, we can overcome any obstacle. It is true, Zul'jin said, nodding his head. Our army must be united and loyal to our cause if we are to succeed. If we fail to maintain discipline and trust within our ranks, then victory will surely slip from our grasp. Zogga spoke up then, asking, but how do we know when to attack? How do we know when the time is right? Harguth smiled and replied, that is a wise question, Zogga. The answer lies in understanding the enemy's movements and intentions. We must watch for their weaknesses and exploit them to our benefit. Only then will we have the upper hand in battle. Harguth looked to Zul'jin. It is true, he said, that victory lies in the knowledge of these 5 points. We must be aware of our strengths and weaknesses, and be prepared for whatever the enemy may throw at us. We must also ensure that our spirit remains strong throughout all our ranks, and that we are not interfered with by any outside forces. Zul'jin's eyes were still fixed on the fire. We must also remember, he added after a moment, that fortune favors the bold. We must take risks if we are to succeed, but make sure we do so wisely. He paused for a moment before continuing, and most importantly, we must stay united. At this, Zogga spoke up, his voice timid but earnest. But what if we fail, he asked, his gaze darting between Harguth and Zul'jin. Harguth placed a comforting hand on Zogga's shoulder. If we fail, he said softly, then we will have done our best. That is all anyone can ask of us. He paused for a moment, then continued. But I believe in us, and I believe in the strength of our tribe. We will prevail. The fire crackled and spat sparks into the night sky, filling the air with the scent of burning wood. The three sat in silence for a few moments more, contemplating the plan ahead of them. Finally, Harguth stood and gestured for the others to do the same. Let us go now, he said, and prepare for battle. Zul'jin gestured with his hands as he spoke. We must be wary of our enemies and know ourselves if we are to succeed in battle. We must remember that victory does not always come with a single attack. He paused for a moment and looked at Harguth. But we must also remember that even the most powerful army can be defeated if the enemy knows its weaknesses. Harguth nodded slowly. Indeed, he said. Our ancestors taught us that knowledge is power and that we must use it to our advantage if we are to win battles. We must be mindful of our enemies and our own strengths and weaknesses if we are to prevail. He glanced at Zogga and gave him a short grunt of approval before continuing. It is only through careful planning and strategy that we will be victorious.